now to welcome Yash Tandon, someone we can certainly consider an achiever and a thought leader. Now, Yash is a Ugandan political activist, author, and policymaker. He's been involved in politics for decades, being forced to leave Uganda in 1972 with the rise to power of Idi Amin. While in exile, he became engaged in underground political work and was a founding member of the Uganda National Liberation Front. Yash Tandon, thank you very much indeed for coming in. Now, you were hugely instrumental in the struggle against the dictatorship of Idi Amin in the 1970s in Uganda. Tell us about that.
Well, I was part of a movement, and that movement was underground and had established guerrilla units within Uganda, but we were largely operating from Tanzania, from Dar es Salaam. Many of us were academics. I was a professor at Dar es Salaam University. And of course, Amin lasted for 9 years. It took us a long time to mobilize forces both within Uganda, but also, and significantly, Tanzania. So it was Tanzania who led the counterattack against Uganda.
Yes, they led the vanguard of that movement against him. So you went from being a professor at a university to being a freedom fighter.
Well, parallel. Overground, I was professor. Underground, I was a freedom fighter. That's right, yes.
How hard was the decision to go into exile? Give us a sense of what that period was like.
Well, Amin came to power, as you know, in 1971, mainly as a result of internal divisions, political as well as ethnic.
He essentially took advantage of it.
And I tell you who took advantage of that. I'll be very clear about that. Britain took advantage of that, because in 1979, what am I talking? In 1969, 68, 69, Obote announced the Common Man's Charter, which was to nationalize major commanding heights of the economy. I was one of the authors of the Common Man's Charter, by the way. And of course, Britain would not allow that. So when things began to go bad internally within Uganda, ideologically and ethnically, the British and Israel took advantage of that. And they were the ones who put Amin into power.
So essentially, Idi Amin was a puppet of the British and the Israelis, but of course it backfired in the end, didn't it?
Backfired.
You were one of those, the principal organizers of the May 1979 Moshi conference for the launch of the UNLF government. Just tell us about that.
Well, it was hard. The reason is that we had several counter forces against Amin, something like 35, 40 organizations in UK, in USA, as well as in Africa. Now, only few of them, 5 or 6 of them, had guerrilla forces underground and operating in Uganda. We were not at that time organized as a guerrilla movement. We means a group of us working to unite all factions, irrespective of ideology or ethnicity, against Amin. Now, Obote and Museveni, who is now in power, were the top leaders at the time, having forces within Uganda. And Nyerere was trying to organize these two forces to take over power, but there was disagreement. And we were on the sideline. So, without Tanzania's support, we organized the Moshi Conference. And it's then when we organized the Moshi Conference on our own strength, bringing all forces opposed to Amin together, it's then that Nyerere came down, Tanzania came down to give us official support.
And eventually, of course, Idi Amin fell. What was it like returning to Uganda after that period in exile?
Chaotic, violent, unpredictable. Uganda National Liberation Front was a good organization, but too ambitious, a bit too early for its time. People were not quite ready for us. And we could not solve the divisions overnight. We had hoped that we might stay a long enough period. But to cut the story short, the UNLF government lasted 1 year, exactly 1 year.
But of course you played a very prominent part in that government. You were clearly a respected member. Not only were you a member of the National Consultative Council, but you also were Minister of State.
I was Minister of State for Internal Affairs at one time, and information, for a very short time, actually. There were 4 of us that history books in Uganda will tell you. We were called the Gang of 4. We were at that 1 year
reminiscent
period.
of China, is it?
Absolutely. Well, different
yes,
way.
Different, obviously, context.
Different political context.
But of course, in 1980, your government was overthrown.
That's right.
In a military coup, and you had to once again go into exile. How difficult was that?
This time it was very difficult because at the time that the coup occurred, we were in Uganda, and my daughter was in UK. But we were then besieged by the very forces. I had a security guard from Tanzania. When the coup came, the Tanzanian troops took over my house, and I was held,
Did you fear for your life?
Yeah, well, not really. In these times, you don't think of life. You think of what best to do, politically speaking. I was a very political person. Anyway, it's a long story. I managed to get out of that.
And here you are.
And here I am.
And of course, subsequent to that, you spent a lot of time studying and lecturing around the world. I mean, when you look back, what are some of the highlights for you? Just briefly, because I know you met Idi Amin long before the Troubles actually began. Right.
Well, then we were in exile second time. We were in Kenya in exile. And that was difficult. By December 1980, there were elections, and Obote and Museveni contested, besides others. And Museveni lost. Obote came back to power, and Museveni went back to the bushes. And we were in Kenya at the time, our core of the Uganda National Liberation Front. We called it UNLF, anti-dictatorship. It was difficult because Obote was in power. Then he managed to get President Moi to throw us out of Kenya.
Right, so it was a continuing saga, as it were. But just very briefly, you had this extraordinary encounter with Idi Amin, didn't you?
Oh, yes.
Inside a lecture hall. Tell me about that.
Well, it was actually the television, Uganda television.
Right.
I was running a program called Topic for Discussion. And as I was organizing the speakers who were there and the cameras and so on, well, who should walk in but Amin? At the time.
Idi Amin.
Idi Amin. And Obote, President Obote, then was attending the Commonwealth meeting in Singapore. Or was it? Yes, Singapore. And he just came in. He's a huge fellow. And he just picked where I was sitting and picked me up bodily, walked me over to the exit door and threw me out, literally, and took over the chair. And he directed the people, the production manager, to focus on him, and he made that famous statement of his saying that he fears nobody except Allah. And
that's extraordinary.
And well, days after that, the coup took place, and Obote never could come back.
So did you suspect at that point, was this a man to be feared?
I was advisor to the Makerere Students' Union, and the president of the union, who now is a minister in Uganda right now, and myself, we issued a statement against the coup. So we were then targeted, and I won't go into that.
Do you think you're lucky to be alive then?
Several times there was attempts on my life.
Because he did have he had a reputation for being quite brutal.
Oh yes, of course. Well, at one time he picked up my father, thinking that I was the one that the troops were picking up, and had I been there, I would have been, of course.
Hope your father survived.
But my father survived.
Very
somehow.
good.
Yes.
Now, all of that, I mean, you've had a fascinating background. I could talk to you for much longer. Obviously, we have limited time.
Right.
But, I mean, you've spent a lot of time studying and lecturing around the world.
Right.
You won the 1962 David Davis Memorial Institute and International Peace Prize. What did you win that for?
I was a student at the London School of Economics,
Right.
and there was a contest on best essay on how to bring about global peace. I won that prize. Because I am essentially, although I was part of a guerrilla movement, I am essentially non-violent. I believe that changes can come non-violently. And my essay was about United Nations peacekeeping and how it can be an instrument for peace. Well, I won that prize. That was a long time ago.
That's very interesting.
I didn't realize it was all put down in your brief.
Well, yes, somebody did their research, didn't they? Now you were born in 1939
That's
in
right.
the village of Kabaramaido.
That's right.
In the Teso district of
right.
Uganda.
Right.
What was your childhood like, and how did that influence your choice to become involved in politics when you got older?
Well, I won't go too much details, but the most impressive persons were my parents. My mother, she just died last year. She died at the age of 101, having given birth to 8 children.
Wow.
My father was a Ghanaian. He took business in an area called Moroto. This is in the northwest of Uganda. It was an area that was where people, which was a closed area by the British administration. Nobody could go there except the administration and the native people there, the Karimojong. Our family was the only one allowed there to do business. My father was a businessman, and we was kind of a frontier shop with everything there. I grew up in Karimoya and amongst the Karimojong, and I learned a lot.
I can imagine.
I didn't realize. From the Karimojong, now Karimojong is violent. At that time, no. It's an amazing system of peace that the Karimojong had. They were what anthropologists call acephalos. In other words, they had no state. And yet, their norms. So that influenced me a lot. And father being a Gandhian, he influenced me a lot.
Right.
And that's why I got into politics.
You're still the chairman of the Southern and Eastern Trade Information and Negotiations Institute. Tell us about your work there.
CITINI started in 1997. It was after the first World Trade Organization ministerial meeting in Singapore, and I was there. I was shocked to see that African delegations were making speeches in the plenary session, including Nigeria, Uganda, and so on. And things were being decided behind their backs in something called green rooms, where only the big powers come, United States, Europe, Japan, and some invited big powers like China, India, and so on. Not a single African. They made an agreement on IT, information technology, and so on. And you know, the World Trade Organization, when an agreement is made, it is binding. If you don't agree, there are sanctions, even if you're not party to the agreement. So I came home and I said, why is it that African countries signed that Uruguay agreement, when in fact it is the only body, apart from Security Council of the UN, that has teeth? You know, they can have sanctions. And I did research on that, and I found, amazingly, all African countries that signed Uruguay, nobody had read it, and nobody had ratified it. There was no discussion in the parliament.
Right.
So then I set up this CITINI in an effort to create a body to capacitate African trade negotiators.
And did that have much impact?
Enormous impact over the years. We are now in existence 15 years, and not entirely as a result of our efforts, but in combination with other forces, we were able to, for example, stop the Seattle World Trade Organization ministerial. We were able to stop the Cancun ministerial. So it not just alone, but I was in these ministerial meetings part of official delegations of African countries.
Now, as you look at those trade negotiations and the World Trade Organization and all these discussions, I mean, how do you, what sense do you get of how trade policies are tilted in favor or against African countries?
Well, almost entirely against African countries. Why? because Africa has a lot of resources. It has got investment possibilities. That's one reason why it's targeted by big market players, United States, Europe, and so on. But secondly, also because our leadership, and I'll be very blunt here, have become extremely dependent on aid, the so-called development aid, which is not development at all, on European and Western countries. So they are very vulnerable to pressure.
Yes.
And the combination of these two factors is that at every ministerial meeting, Africans have had a raw deal, except for a group of countries called LDCs, least developing countries, that have certain quota-free, duty-free access to Western markets.
So do you think those things are changing now, or is it still as bad as it was when you started a few years ago?
World Trade Organization is a war machine. It's caught up in an ideology which has sucked all of us, including myself, up to a point in time. Now I'm opposed to that. Namely that free market is good for you. Open up your markets and you'll be able to compete in the global market on basis your best advantage, comparative advantage. This is complete nonsense.
Because of course it's not a level playing field, is it?
It's not a level playing field. It is, economics is an abstraction from reality on the ground.
And that brings me to a very interesting point, because you said that economics is not a science as claimed by its practitioners, but instead is an ideology. What do you mean by that?
Well, that's exactly it is. It's from the time of Adam Smith to the Chicago School of Economists, monetary economists, even to Stiglitz. It's an ideology. It's ideology reflecting various class interests, various national interests. It is not a science at all. It never has been a science. It has been presented as a science to give it that authority, but it's not. And unfortunately, it is being used by economists, even economists from our countries.
But is it fair to say that all of economics is an ideology, or certainly branches of economics? Because, for example, capitalism and the free market, I mean, that could be construed to be an ideology.
Well, we have been under capitalism for 300 years. From the time of, as I said, Adam Smith, the Wealth of Nations, where he presented free trade as science. Or, in fact, he didn't. He was much more clever than that. It was a political economy. It became a science under Marshall. And Marshall made neoclassical economics, and that became a science. And then came all this fetish about statistics and models and so on, presenting itself as if it is a science. No, it has been ideology ever since the Adam Smith time to today's time. Economic theory. There's not a single, not even Marxist theory, by the way, is scientific. It's an ideology of the working class.
We turn now to his latest book, Trade is War, which challenges the view that free trade aids development. Rather, Yash insists it leaves a trail of violence and impoverishment on those in the poorest regions of the world. Now, this book suggests that, contrary to popular belief, free trade hinders development. Where do you take that notion from?
From experience. I was an academic for many years. Then I joined the my created organization called CITINI, as we discussed earlier. And there I began to understand what was happening in reality on the ground. And I discovered that World Trade Organization was a set of regulations worked out by United States, Europe, and Japan mainly, to their advantage. We were not party to the making of those regulations. And the decision-making in World Trade Organization by consensus, that means even one state can object and there is no decision. And yet, they were able to manipulate the entire decision-making process, year after year, ministerial conference after ministerial, to bring about decisions that favor the big countries and that disadvantage the poorer countries, the weaker countries, including China, India, and Brazil, for example.
What I find quite extraordinary, I mean, you've put this, you've codified this, if you like, in a book, which is what makes it very interesting, because these are thoughts, disparate thoughts that have been expressed variously by different African countries. And your book also looks at globalization, which it says is reducing aspects of modern life to being under the control of multinational corporations. And our concern here is how that ultimately affects the African continent.
Well, the control of the multinational, transnational corporations is deepening because the very processes of capitalism creates what's called concentration of capital. So, for example, in our own times now, they are talking about TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership Agreement with Europe and with the Pacific countries too. This is driven by the transnational corporations because they want to globalize trade and production and appropriate every possibility where they can control production, mainly through technology and patented technology and shareholdings, of course. So that's the process that's taking place. In Africa, the effect has been devastating, because most Africa has been deindustrialized. In my time in Uganda, we had, for example, 6 textile mills, vertically integrated from cotton production to fabric, gone. Industries don't exist anymore. In fact, we are now de-agriculturalized too. You see in shops in Kampala, chicken legs from Europe. Chicken legs. We have plenty of chickens in Uganda, but we can't compete against subsidized chicken from Europe. So this whole thing is a relentless war against Africa.
So when you sit back and you see all those pictures of, starving children on television, poverty-ravaged continent and so on, what goes through your mind?
Well, because that should not be there. Africa is not poor. We have, needless to say, huge amount of resources that attracts a lot of people. No, Africa is poor because economy is not in their control.
Well, certainly African leaders have contributed to that poverty, haven't they?
Well, the first generation of leaders were visionary. I would say people like Nyerere, Nkrumah, these were, even Lumumba, these were leadership who had a vision. They were either eliminated, Lumumba was killed, or thrown out of power.
And do you see a Western hand in all of that?
In all of this Western hand, definitely, because of course they could not go along with leadership that had an alternative vision for Africa. That vision is lost now. So now have a new kind of leadership.
Absolutely. Somebody said it was like cutting a man's legs off, and then he falls on the ground, and you turn a camera on him and say, look, that man can't walk, he can't help himself. Is that too strong a sort of...
You put it so well. You put it so well. That imagery fits Africa.
What is your alternative vision to this current status quo?
Well, it's a big question. It's a systemic issue, but we should not reduce everything to systemic change. I come from left background, and we used to think that, well, nothing will change until we have socialism. I have realized from practice on the ground that, yes, we can wait till kingdom come. No, we have to do something here and now. And the here and now, in my practice, is to try to influence our leadership, knowing well that they are vulnerable, to bring to their attention that they have an obligation to the people. And I've found that it is possible to reach out to your heads of states who have been in power for long. They should not have been in power for too long, but I have not raised that political issue myself. In my work, I have reached out to them to say, hey, don't sign the World Trade Organization meeting, don't sign the Economic Partnership Agreement with Europe, because you are sending away the future of Africa.
But the problem, of course, is that those people, as we sort of discussed a minute earlier, a lot of them are driven by their own personal interests. They need money, which they don't have, because they don't have the skills to develop whatever the potential that their country has, or they're not doing it the right way. And essentially, they need that aid money in order to fund their political empires. And so what you're saying to them is not something they're willing to listen. Any form of pressure that's exerted where money is offered, they'll take it.
There is capital and there is money. Capital goes into production. It is really, capital is savings of the past that goes into production. Okay? And money is simply a medium of exchange. Whoever has money and capital becomes the master of the economy. Who doesn't have it becomes a slave. That's what happens to
That sounds
Africa.
quite theoretical, almost Marxist.
Well,
and my next logical question is going to be, how do you feel? Because people are going to say, I mean, you are to some extent a socialist, aren't you? I mean, people are going to say, well, when you look at, the former Soviet Union, it's collapsed and it's now essentially a capitalist country. When you look at China, with its communist ideology, it's moved away from that, certainly in terms of its economic planning, to a more capitalist sort of approach. I mean, that essentially, capitalism has become the unequal distribution of wealth, and as somebody said, socialism is the equal distribution of miseries.
Well, in my last chapter in the book, if you get down to that, I myself say that the Communist Manifesto is dead.
It is.
It's dead. What is now is a manifesto for nations to fight against the empire. It's not socialist ideology, it's a national liberation. So I'm no longer on the socialist plank. It may come, may not come, I don't know. But we are on the plank of national liberation. And we are within the capitalist system. And national liberation involves us to be in control of our natural resources.
One of the things you also talk about is alternative currencies.
That's right.
What do you mean by that?
Well, in the struggle, we need now to, what I call, disengage from the capitalist system, from the globalization system. And if you don't disengage, they will disengage you. In other words, they say globalization is like gravity. You have to be part of globalization. Not true. Because if you don't go along with their lines, sanctions, so they have delinked Russia, they're delinked China, they're delinking Iran. So before they delink you, before they dislocate you, you disengage yourself first as a matter of policy. In that, one of the things you have to have is your own currency.
Very briefly, you've been conducting a book tour all over Europe. What's the reception been to your ideas?
Oh, beyond my expectations. The book has, it's sold lots of copies. I don't want to boast about that. I go with small number of copies and they all get sold immediately. I was interviewed this afternoon by radio from Luxembourg. Last evening, I was interviewed by television from California. Last week, I was interviewed by RT, Radio Russian Television.
And today, you're interviewed by Arise.
By you, so...
Yash Tandon, I want to thank you exceedingly for coming in.
Thank you so much.